Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to be painting these ducks swimming in clear water, and I'm going to begin by masking the sides of my paper. So this is the image that I found on Pinterest which inspired me to paint this. I just thought that it looks so cute. I love the color combination and I love how the water looks so clean and fresh. So I'm going to try to attempt painting my own composition using the same subject matter. I personally wanted the ducks to be more evenly distributed across the page, so I'm not going to copy the exact positions of the ducks like the reference image. Instead, I'm going to take some of the angles as reference and I'm going to scatter the ducks according to the composition that I had in mind. Looking at some of the ducks in the picture, I just referenced the angle or the view of the ducks depending on where they're positioned, either at the bottom or at the top of the frame, since there's a slight perspective going on. So I basically referenced the ducks at the bottom for the ducks that I want to place at the bottom of my frame and so on, but I just scatter them by shifting their placement very slightly to fit the even composition that I'm looking for. In terms of the size of the ducks, I want them to be more or less even, but I feel like the ones at the back can be a little bit smaller in comparison to the ones in front or in the middle, since the ones at the back would be a little bit further away. So either make them all completely uniform or make the ones at the back slightly smaller, but definitely not bigger. I actually made this mistake before when I was sketching it out and it looked really big because of the perspective. So just keep that in mind if you're going to sketch your own ducks. If not, I will also have the outline of the ducks available in my coffee shop. After I'm done with the sketch, let me just go over the colors that I'll be using. This is Hansa Yellow Medium by Daniel Smith, Vermilion by Holbein, Hansa Yellow Light by Daniel Smith, Grey by Holbein, Graphite Grey by Daniel Smith, Azure Blue by White Knights, and I'll also be using Bleedproof White by Dr. P.H. Martins. I'm going to begin by painting the ducks. For this, I'm going to use a mix of Graphite Grey and Grey of Grey, and I'm going to play around with the ratio depending on how light or dark I want the grey to be. I'm basically just painting the shadows of the ducks since I want them to be white, so I'm starting with a lighter consistency, placing the shadows at the bottom below the wings, along the neck, and so on. I want the shadows to be fairly smooth and subtle all throughout except for the highlights of the ducks or whichever area is hit by the most light. For those areas, I'm just going to leave as the white of the paper. As for the slightly darker shadows, I want to place them in areas like behind the throat or the neck of the duck to show the curve, as well as places like under the wings, side by side to separate the left and the right wings, the thighs of the ducks, under the wings, and soft feathers below the tail. The idea is basically to just separate the specific anatomy of the ducks, and this will help show the form. Whenever I'm a bit unsure, I would always use a lighter value and a lighter consistency, because if you don't like where you've placed some of the grays, it's much easier to just take off the wet paint using tissue, and if you do like the shadows that you've placed, you can always layer on more paint to enhance the value. It also helps to look at the reference image to know where to place certain shadows if you ever feel stuck. So here, after placing the lighter shadows, I want to enhance the shapes further, so I'm going to use a thicker consistency with a bit more graphite gray in the ratio, and this will give me a much darker gray, which I'm going to apply to enhance the form. As you're painting on the ducks, don't overthink it and also don't overwork it with the darker shadows, even if you feel like certain details might be missing, because the ducks are white anyway, so the shadows here are actually very subtle, and the color of the water later will actually help with the overall shape of the silhouette of these ducks. So I'm just going to keep painting on the shadows for the rest of the ducks. Once I've painted the grays for all of the ducks, I'm going to continue to paint the beak. I'm going to use a mix of Hansa yellow with a bit of vermilion to create this orange. I'm going to mute the orange slightly by adding a tiny bit of graphite gray. Again, I'm just going to paint using this one color for the beak. I'm not going to add any shadows or anything like that. I feel like the shape is enough for your eyes to adjust to the form anyway. As for the eyes, I'm just going to draw it on using my waterproof black ink pen. And this just makes it much easier to create those really small circles. Then I'm just going to add a tiny little dot using bleed proof white as highlights for the eyes. Now on to the fun part, let's paint the water. For the water, I'm going to use a mix of Azure blue with Hansa yellow light to create a bluish green. Then I'm going to lighten it by using a lot of gray. And to mute the color slightly, I'm going to add a tiny bit of graphite gray. This will be the base color for the water, which I'm going to paint throughout the whole page. So I do want to have a good amount on my palette, and I'm going to paint it on using a medium to thin consistency. To begin, I'm going to start by painting ripples surrounding the ducks. Here I'm just using this one color and I'm leaving out some white negative space as highlights of the ripples. For those ripples closer to the duck, I want them to be a little bit tighter and more round, and as I get towards the outer part, then I try to loosen it, making the waves a little bit more abstract. This is going to apply to every single duck here, so as I get closer to the duck, I'm going to start adding the tight ripples again. The ripples should be in front of the duck, and behind the duck will be a longer trail, so it shows the direction where the duck is moving. Let me show you another one that's maybe a bit clearer. Here you can see in front of the duck, I made the ripples more rounded and tight as the duck is trying to push through the water, and behind the duck is the trail of longer ripples. As I get to the duck at the top of the page, because there's a bit more distance in terms of our view, there will be a change in perspective, so those ripples will be a little bit more flat, more like a thin oval rather than a rounder one. This will create the illusion of depth and will help with the perspective of your painting. For the water in between the ripples, I would just treat this as my sparkly water painting technique by painting on some random blobs next to each other, leaving gaps of white negative space. This is actually the same technique that I'm going to use to finish this painting as I layer on more of the water texture. So if you want to see more of the basic approach of this technique, I would definitely recommend for you to check that video out if you haven't already, and I'll link it in the description box as well as the end of this video. I would treat the abstract blobs the same way as I did the ripples, so as it gets further at the top of my page, I would try to make these blobs thinner or more flat to add to the perspective of the painting. And as it gets closer to the bottom of the page, I don't mind making these blobs a bit thicker and larger as they're closer to the viewpoint. When I'm painting really close to the ducks, especially near really detailed areas like the tail and the beak, I like to make it easier on myself by outlining the ducks using the blue first. This will create a barrier so the water doesn't run further into the ducks. I'm just going to keep painting more of these blobs as well as the round ripples for the ducks at the bottom until I fill the whole page. Once I fill in the whole page with the first layer of blobs, I'm going to move on to the second layer. For this, I'm going to use the exact same mixture as before. That's from Azure Blue, Hansa Yellow Light, Graphite Grey, and Grey of Grey. This time I'm going to use less Grey of Grey though, so the color will be a little bit darker in value. How much Hansa Yellow Light will also depend on how bluish green you want the color to be. Personally, I wanted the water to be somewhat like a shallow water, so this is why I want it to be a bit more bluish green instead of a deeper blue, but this is something that you can play around with depending on your taste. If you've painted along to my sparkly water technique, you know the drill by now. For the second layer, I'm going to paint on more blobs and ripples in between the first layer of blobs while still leaving out that white negative space empty. I want to overlay the blobs so one blob of the second layer might go through several blobs of the first layer, leaving out a bit of the base color from the first layer as negative space in between the blobs along with the white of the paper. If this sounds a little bit confusing for you, I did sketch it out in the previous tutorial that I made, since I did cover this more in a basic way, but hopefully through this painting it's still clear enough for you to follow. Let me try to explain again. So here, as you can see, I'm going to make one blob that is going through the ripples. So I'm connecting the color while leaving out the white of the paper still empty from the first layer. And here, as I'm making the second blob, you can see that I'm leaving out again a little bit of negative space in between, but I'm trying to connect the blob into the other puddle. Let's look at another example here on the larger blobs. Here I'm painting one blob as the second layer in between two blobs from the first layer, but you can also do this over a few blobs depending which type of intersection you're placing your second layer of blob. I'm basically just going to keep repeating the same step until I fill in the rest of the page with the second layer. Here's another clear example of the blobs. As you can see, I'm placing it on an intersection of 4 blobs from the first layer. So I'm kind of connecting the one blob through those 4 sections. This is the same technique that I'm going to keep repeating for the third as well as the fourth layer. This is why the second layer is very important for you to understand. So again, I'm just going to keep filling in the whole page with the second layer using the same method. I'm going to try to not skip too much, so hopefully it's clear for you guys to see what the second layer looks like and the process of how I paint it. Once I finish filling the whole page with the second layer, I'm going to move on to the third layer. For this, I'm going to create an even darker blue by using the same mix as before, but with even less gray of gray. With the third layer, I'm going to enhance the ripples around the ducks, but I'm still going to leave out the white of the paper from the first layer, and if the second layer is really distinct, I'm also going to leave the space out from the second layer. So I'm essentially using the same method, but now within the first and second layer. However, if the second layer is not that clear, I don't mind painting over it either, and the shapes that I'm making now is less of those blobs but more of the ripply texture. For this layer, I'm not going to fill in the whole page since I feel like the second layer has a nice enough texture already. Instead, I'm going to just focus on the ripples surrounding the ducks, and hopefully you can see what I meant before when I said I would go over the second layer if the blobs doesn't have a clear distinction between them, but I would still separate the lines of the ripples if there's a distinct separation between those two blobs from the second layer. This only applies to the second layer though. I'm definitely going to leave out the white space from the first layer, which is the white of the paper, because those white lines will act as the highlights of the water texture. So if I paint over the white lines, I will essentially paint over those white highlights. For some of the blobs and the ducks at the bottom, since we can see a bit more of the water, I like to actually extend the ripples a little bit more for the third layer. So after adding some ripples, I like to add on some smaller blobs surrounding the ripples. After painting on the third layer, I'm quite happy with how the textures are looking, so I'm going to leave it for now and move on to the highlights. For this, I'm going to create a really bright yellow-green color by using Hansa Yellow Light with a bit of the blue that I already had on my palette. I'm also going to add some gray of gray to give a similar tone to the water. Here I'm going to glaze over a light consistency of this color over parts of the water and the white highlights, and I just find that this gives a slight glow to the water. I'm being very sparing with this though. I'm not going to cover the whole white area. I just want certain places to have a slight change in hue. Now I'm going to create the shadows under the ducks. For this, I'm going to create a really dark blue from Azure Blue and Graphite Grey. I'm using a medium to thick consistency of this, and I'm painting more ripple textures right under the duck while still leaving that white space. I'm not going to paint as much for this dark shadow. I'm only going to paint it really close to the duck and over a few ripples, so there's actually a slight gradient going from the shadow to the third layer and then to the first and second layer. After I've painted on the shadows underneath all of the ducks, I'm going to just make sure the lines or the silhouettes of the duck is nice and clean, so I'm going to darken certain areas surrounding the ducks. Lastly, I'm going to add some sparkly highlights using a thick consistency of bleed-proof white, and I'm not going to do too much of this. This will just act as sparkles on the water where the light hits it. I tried to actually use the bleed-proof white to add more of the ripply texture or to redefine the gaps between the blobs, but I felt like the white is a bit too strong for that, so I'm just going to stick with the dots. Once I'm done, I'm going to unmask the sides and reveal the painting. So this is basically the finished painting. I absolutely loved painting this one. I just found it so relaxing and therapeutic to paint in the water texture. Like usual, all the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in my description box. If you like what you see today, please consider subscribing. Thanks for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!